When you think of fantasy, what comes to mind? Maybe it's vast woods filled with fantastical creatures. Or maybe it's Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings. But the truth is, fantasy is an expansive genre that encompasses a wide range of subgenres within various forms of entertainment. The term fantasy can be traced back to the Greek word fantasia, which basically means imaginary creation. As a result, there are two main forms of fantasy. Stories that exist solely in the realm of imagination are considered high fantasy, while any form of literature in our world that incorporates fantastic elements such as magic, mythical creatures, the supernatural, and imaginary worlds are classified as low fantasy. But to fully understand fantasy as a genre, we have to take a trip through its history. Fantasy literature finds its origins in ancient tales and myths. While not fantasy to the people who subscribe to these beliefs, elements within these mythologies, like different worlds, elves, giants, and the fantastical, all appear in more fantasy stories. Epics such as the Iliad, the Odyssey, Beowulf, and the Book of 1001 Nights are rich with elements of the fantastic, featuring deities, monsters, and magic. The Epic of Gilgamesh, an epic poem from around 4,000 years ago, stands as one of the earliest examples of this proto-fantasy tradition. Through the ages, religious myths, local legends, and cultural beliefs laid the groundwork for storytelling. And as new cultures emerged, they brought fresh elements to these narratives, but the real story of fantasy begins during the medieval ages. While not as dark as they're often painted to be, the medieval age would have been an interesting time to be alive. It really is the last time that the world was totally isolated. Whole continents were still unknown. Crusades and conquests brought back stories of faraway places and seemingly endless landscapes. I mean, if you think about it, when we imagine fantasy, we usually imagine castles, knights, kings, and dragons, all of which, of course, existed or were thought to exist in the medieval age. In medieval tales, magical and marvelous occurrences were usually connected with journeys. Knights leaving courts for forests filled with mysterious creatures, for instance. Or maybe merchants and pilgrims traveling to distant lands. The Far East, with its seemingly endless deserts and strange creatures, captured the imagination of medieval folk more than anything. Particularly India at first, and later China, were some of the largest suppliers for magical creatures for artists sketching maps of the world. This is supposed to be a hippo, which they believed was a water dragon. So yeah, not very accurate. Travel writers would not be outdone, however. Some medieval manuscripts of the travel of Marco Polo, an account told by, Marco Polo, in the late 12th century, are known by the title Book of the Marvels of the World. The text even begins with, "Read this book. In it you will find very great and wondrous things of the nations, chiefly Armenia, Persia, Tartary, India, and various other provinces." The Oriental lands described in it are sometimes populated with marvelous creatures like the Cinephali, or dog-headed men. The artists who illuminated Polo's tales took it upon themselves to exaggerate the strange landscapes by adding creatures unmentioned in the text, like the Blemmies, a race of headless people who hunt spice traders in the long desert nights, or the Skyopods, which are basically a whole city whose members only have one foot. In Western medieval culture, strange beings like those constituted the very essence of the marvels associated with the world. However, in the medieval ages, magic was not always so far away. When it was near, though, it was confined to particular places, like the islands and forests where Arthurian knights rode off to find adventure. Le Morte d'Arthur from the period tells the story of, well, King Arthur and his fantastical adventures and daring escapades with the Knights of the Round Table. The magic that is found there strikes us less as a change of landscape than a change of era. The Chronicle of a Monk from Saint Denis, written in the early 15th century, recounts that in 1380, King Charles VI encountered a stag in the forest of Selinus. The beast bore a collar engraved with the inscription in Latin, asserting that the object had been bestowed upon him by Julius Caesar, and the king was informed that the animal had indeed been living in those woods since the long-gone era. That, too, is a common motif in fantasy. With its countless forests filled with millennia-old elves, Robert Holdstock's Mythica Wood is also based on the idea that magic induces a kind of time travel, enabling us to encounter archaic, legendary creatures. In fantasy, the wondrous is assimilated to imaginary creations, symbolizing our lost pre-industrial society. So its portrayals are accompanied by a nostalgia for the natural world that modern people have lost touch with. Not to jump ahead, but for example, Tolkien's elves are supposed to catch the last vessels to reach the territory of Valinor, where they will stay for eternity. Quote, "Magic had died in the west when the doom fell on Valyria and the lands of the long-lost summer." But back to our timelines. The next major leap for fantasy was in the Victorian era. Although it draws inspiration from older magical tales, myths, legend, and epic poems, fantasy as its own specific genre truly emerged in the late 19th century in England during the Victorian and Edwardian eras. Its birth and growth accompanied historic upheaval that was at once social, economic, and existential, and that profoundly affected the mentalities as well as the lifestyles in England. You have to keep in mind that England, with its vast colonial empire, was the world's largest economic power, and it experienced brutal industrialization. In that culturally rich context, a handful of writers chose to focus on the supernatural and fantastical and to seek refuge in enchanted worlds. Thus was modern fantasy born. England already enjoyed a rich tradition of imaginative literature, notably with the significance of the Romantic and Gothic movements in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Actually, works in the Gothic genre would continue to be produced in England throughout the Victorian age, from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in 1818 to Oscar Wilde's Portrait of Dorian Gray in 1890, and finally Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897. The revival of romances, a term which was used opposed to novel to designate adventure-filled fanciful stories in the Romantic style, was the last incarnation of the anti-modernist, anti-realist movements. This time, elsewhere came in the shape of faraway lands and little-known cultures the colonial empires had introduced to the Europeans. Robert Louis Stevenson, a well-traveled writer and poet and the celebrated author of both Treasure Island and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, is an excellent example of that movement. He can kind of be credited as the first children's author. In Victorian stories, the fantasy hero is in almost constant contact with the supernatural, and the English's African expeditions are a perfect pretext to explore primitive modes of thought and lost civilizations. The adventure novel and fantasy genres were very similar, often overlapping at the time. Once again, not to jump ahead, but the trademarks of Victorian fantasy can be found all over The Lord of the Rings. See, it's presented as a travel narrative in which the hero leaves a well-known center to head towards wondrous magical lands on the distant outskirts of society, Its main characters are little hobbits living in a region reminiscent of the 19th century European countryside who leave their native land to embark on an epic quest. The passage from the Two Towers, which is the second volume of the series, in which Sam Gamgee catches sight of a, quote, Oilifant, is quite revealing on the kind of mindset of the time. To his astonishment and terror and lasting delight, Sam saw a vast shape crash out of the trees and come careening down the slope. Big as a house, much bigger than a house, it looked down on him. A gray-clad moving hill. Fear and wonder maybe enlarged him in the hobbit's eyes, but the Mumik of Harad was indeed a beast of vast bulk, and the like of him does not now walk in Middle-earth. Once again, you can kind of see how this is probably like Victorian explorers journeying into these distant lands and finding what they probably believed magical creatures. During the Victorian era, the pastor and theologian George MacDonald was one of the most popular writers and can be truly credited as writing the very first high fantasy novel. This was Phantastes, whose full title when it was published was, get this, Phantastes, a fairy romance for men and women and Lilith a romance. So yeah, kind of a mouthful. However, today, while he was very, very important, his apprentice is definitely more famous than MacDonald was. This is, of course, Lewis Carroll, who wrote Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Now, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland was massive. Like, it was everywhere. Queen Victoria herself read it to her children, and this sparked a second flourish of fantasy books in the late Victorian time. This included J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, and in America, The Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Peter Pan in particular really shows once again the Victorian tendency to romanticize exploration. The protagonist leaves what could be considered as the capital of the entire world at the time, which was Victorian-era London, to a land far more magical and pastoral, Neverland. However, while fantasy was born in the late 19th century, the genre as we know it was defined by the work of two men in the 1950s. Perhaps the greatest fantasy authors of all time, J.R.R. Tolkien with his Lord of the Rings, and C.S. Lewis with The Chronicles of Narnia. With their writing group, the Inklings, they single-handedly revolutionized fantasy for the modern time, creating vast worlds with exquisitely detailed languages and mythologies. Tolkien, in particular, basically created the notion of high fantasies since George MacDonald. While fantasy stories in the past usually had non-magical characters from our world journeying into magical ones, Tolkien's mythos treated its world with seriousness and never left its own reality. Post-World War I and during World War II, fantasy stories featured dark and horrific creatures battling the armies of good. I mean, there's really no comparison between Captain Hook and Sauron. To go into Tolkien's full body of work, we would need an entire other video, but to put it simply, Tolkien unified all the little elements of fantasy in the past and put them into one massive fantasy story and pretty much cemented the looks, traits, and tropes that we expect from any modern fantasy story that we hear today. I mean, he single-handedly created the elves, dwarves, and orcs that are so often featured in fantasy books that you can get off the shelf now. And finally, this brings us to modern fantasy. Contemporary fantasy stories often take place in familiar settings with magical and supernatural elements blended into everyday life. These narratives explore topics such as identity, technology, and societal change, examining them through a fantastical lens. The biggest modern fantasy series, of course, include Harry Potter, Game of Thrones, and a variety of novels by Neil Gaiman. Of course, the genre of fantasy is no longer confined to writing or painting because of the likes of movies and television. But even in these new mediums, we can still see the traces of the escapism of the Victorians, the knights and journeys of the medieval era, and the myths of the ancient Greeks and Mesopotamians. And what's to come? Well, as J.R.R. Tolkien wrote, "Don't adventures ever have an end? I suppose not. Someone else always has to carry on the story."